The protests are growing increasingly violent across the capital today.
We will not be silenced. We demand action now.
We were having negotiations with these lunatics.
Jesus said this would happen first, but almost no one understands what that really means. He wasn't describing random chaos. He was outlining a sequence, the first signs that would appear before everything else begins. And those signs are not far away. They are already closer than most people think. In this passage, Jesus gives a clear prophetic roadmap, a way to understand what is happening in the world right now. Once you see it, the news, the conflicts, the tension, all start to make more sense. And once you recognize it, you can't ignore it. If this helped you see it more clearly, like, comment, and subscribe, and let's explore this together. Matthew 24:6-8 opens with a warning that sounds familiar. But the way Jesus frames it changes everything if you read it closely enough. He says, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars," and immediately follows it with a command that feels almost out of place against the weight of those words. "See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." That distinction is not small. It is the foundation for how everything else in the passage is meant to be understood. Because Jesus does not point to war as the conclusion. He points to it as the beginning. He does not say, when conflict erupts, the end has arrived. He says the opposite. The presence of war, even widespread war, is not the signal that history has reached its final moment. It is the signal that something has started. A process. A sequence. The opening phase of events that will build, layer by layer, toward what he later describes in the same chapter. And this is exactly where many interpretations begin to break down, because they treat wars as isolated events, moments of chaos with no clear structure or direction. But Jesus presents them differently. Not random, not outside the timeline, but expected. These things must come to pass. That phrase removes the idea of accident. It places conflict within a framework, something permitted, even necessary, as part of a sequence that must unfold before the final act begins. But there is a detail in his wording that carries even more weight than the statement itself. And it is easy to overlook if you read too quickly. He does not say, a war. He says, wars, plural. And then he expands it further. Rumors of wars. Not only the reality of conflict, but the постоянная anticipation of it, the atmosphere, the tension that hangs in the background even when weapons are not actively firing. This is not a single event. It is an entire environment. A world where conflict does not resolve cleanly, but spreads. Where one war fades and another rises. Where the possibility of escalation never disappears, but lingers, shaping decisions, headlines, and the emotional state of entire populations. It is a condition of constant instability, not a momentary crisis. And that is precisely why Jesus connects it to what he calls the beginning of sorrows. The phrase itself can be misunderstood if it is read superficially, because sorrows sounds general, almost vague. But the original word carries a far more specific meaning. It refers to birth pains, labor contractions, a patterned process that signals not random suffering, but an approaching delivery. And that metaphor is exact in ways that are difficult to ignore once you see it. Because birth pains follow a pattern that ordinary suffering does not. First, they escalate. Each contraction is stronger than the one before. The intensity does not stay the same. It builds. And when you lay that pattern over the events Jesus describes, the connection becomes clear. The conflicts do not remain at one level. They intensify. Over time, their scale expands, their impact deepens, and their consequences become increasingly difficult to contain. But the second characteristic is what reveals the progression with even greater clarity. The intervals shorten. At the beginning of labor, contractions are spaced far apart. There is time between them. Time to recover. Time to breathe. But as the moment of delivery approaches, those intervals collapse. Hours become minutes. Minutes become seconds. The pattern compresses. And Jesus indicates that the same structure applies to these events. In earlier periods, the signs appeared with distance between them. Wars occurred, famines emerged, but they were separated by stretches of relative stability. The world had space between the contractions. But the framework he gives does not describe a constant pace. It describes acceleration, a movement from distance to compression, from isolated events to a continuous pattern. And that shift is the key to understanding what he was actually pointing to. Today, the signs are no longer distant or spaced out across history. They are converging. Wars, famines, disease, earthquakes, and persecution are no longer unfolding in isolation, but erupting at the same time across multiple continents, with barely any space between them. The intervals have collapsed. What was once measured in decades is now measured in weeks, sometimes days. The pattern is no longer subtle. It is accelerating. And then comes the third characteristic, the one that carries the most weight. They have a destination. Because birth pains are not meaningless suffering. They are not chaos without direction. Every contraction, no matter how intense, is moving toward a specific moment, the delivery of new life. And Jesus uses that exact imagery to describe these events, not as random global crises, but as purposeful movements within a larger plan. The pain is not without meaning. The suffering is not without direction. It is moving towards something, toward the return of Christ, toward the revealing of the kingdom of God, which means the pain has a point. The suffering has an end point. And that end point is not destruction, but glory. But it does not arrive all at once. It builds, one contraction at a time, one sign layered upon another. Each one increasing the intensity, each one shortening the distance to what comes next. And this is where it shifts from theory to observation. Because the first sign is not something abstract. It is visible, immediate, accessible. You can see it unfolding in real time. Conflicts are no longer contained within borders. What begins as a localized confrontation expands outward, pulling in additional nations, alliances, and interests. What appears at first as a single war quickly fractures into multiple fronts. Retaliation triggers escalation. Escalation triggers expansion. And before resolution can take hold, the conflict has already multiplied. This is not one war. It is many wars overlapping, intersecting, feeding into one another. Multiple nations, multiple battlefields, multiple layers of engagement, all unfolding at once. And what defines this pattern is not just the presence of conflict, but its refusal to remain contained. It spreads, it connects, It intensifies without any clear boundary. And that is exactly where the words of Jesus land with precision that is difficult to ignore. Because he did not say, a nation. He said, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. The language itself expands the scope. It moves beyond a single conflict and describes a global condition. Ethnos against ethnos, groups against groups, kingdoms, systems, powers, all set in motion against one another, not sequentially, simultaneously. And that distinction matters because it aligns perfectly with the environment being described. A world where conflict is no longer confined, but interconnected. Where political entities, cultural identities, and national interests collide across multiple axes at the same time. It is not just war. It is a network of wars. And once that pattern becomes visible, the framing changes. Because what you are looking at is not a series of disconnected headlines. It is a structure, a progression. The early contractions of something that is building, intensifying, and moving toward a moment that has not yet arrived, but is getting closer. Not a single conflict between two powers, contained and clearly defined. What we are witnessing is something else entirely. A matrix of conflicts, multiple nations, multiple fault lines, multiple levels of hostility all operating at the same time. Count the nations involved, and the pattern becomes undeniable. Major powers, regional actors, proxy forces, all drawn into the same expanding tension. What begins as one confrontation does not stay isolated. It spreads, it overlaps, it connects to other conflicts already in motion. This is not one war. It is a system of wars. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Exactly the structure Jesus described. Not a localized conflict, but a global web of hostility, touching every major region, pulling every major power into alignment. Jesus didn't say a war. He said nations, plural. And the plural is exactly what we are seeing unfold. But here is the part most people overlook, because it is not about what is happening. It is about what people believe is about to happen. Rumors of wars. Not just active conflict, but the atmosphere of conflict, the speculation, the tension, the constant sense that the next escalation is always one step away. And that atmosphere reaches further than the wars themselves, because it affects the entire world, not just the battlefield. Right now, the questions themselves are shaping reality. Will the conflict expand? Will more nations be drawn in? Will lines be crossed that cannot be reversed? These are not fringe concerns. They are being discussed at the highest levels, analyzed, debated, and watched in real time. And uncertainty becomes its own kind of force. It destabilizes economies. It erodes confidence. It keeps entire populations in a state of constant anticipation. The fear of war begins to spread faster than the war itself. And that is exactly what Jesus described. Not just wars, but rumors of wars. An environment where conflict is constant and the expectation of greater conflict never disappears. The rumors grow louder, sometimes louder than the weapons themselves. If this made you think differently, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And let's continue uncovering this together. Now, here is the phrase most people read past without stopping, and yet it is the one that determines how everything else in the passage should be understood. Jesus says, "See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." The end is not yet. 5 words, but they carry a weight that reshapes the entire meaning of what he is describing. Because those words do not reduce the importance of the events. They do not suggest that wars are insignificant. They do not tell you to ignore what is unfolding. They mean the opposite. The events are so significant that Jesus addresses them directly, placing them inside a prophetic sequence that must unfold. Must come to pass. Not optional, not accidental, necessary. But they are not the conclusion. And that is where the misunderstanding happens. People hear "not yet" and assume distance, delay, something far removed. But "not yet" does not mean not coming. It means not complete, not finished building. The process has started, but it has not reached its final stage. The birth pains have begun. They are increasing. The intervals are shortening. The intensity is rising. And the signs that follow in Jesus' list are no longer theoretical possibilities. They are visible, measurable, documented. Not isolated, but accelerating. The end is not yet, but the beginning of sorrows has already started. And that beginning is exactly what Jesus said would come first. Now the sequence moves forward because Jesus does not stop at war. He immediately introduces the next sign, and the order is not random. It is connected. War leads into something else, something that spreads beyond the battlefield and reaches into the survival of entire populations. And there shall be famines. That transition is not symbolic, it is causal. War does not only destroy armies, it destroys systems. The systems that produce, transport, and distribute food. And once those systems are disrupted, the effects move outward, step by step, until they reach every level of society. The mechanism is direct. When major energy infrastructure is targeted, refineries, gas fields, export terminals, the immediate result is a spike in energy prices. And energy is not a separate sector. It is the foundation beneath every other system. When the cost of energy rises, the cost of everything connected to it rises as well. Agriculture depends on fuel. Tractors require it to operate. Transportation networks depend on it to move goods from one region to another. Ships carry grain across oceans using it. Refrigeration systems rely on electricity to preserve food during storage and transit. And then there is fertilizer. Modern agriculture is built on it, and fertilizer production depends heavily on natural gas. When natural gas prices surge, the cost of producing fertilizer rises immediately. And when fertilizer becomes more expensive, crop production becomes more expensive. Lower yields, higher costs, reduced supply. Every stage of the chain is affected, from the field to the factory to the transport route to the market. And the impact compounds. It does not remain localized. It spreads across regions, across economies, across entire populations. What begins as a disruption in one sector becomes a pressure applied to the entire global food system. This is not theoretical. It is a chain reaction. War disrupts energy. Energy disruption drives up costs. Rising costs constrain production. Constrained production leads to scarcity. And scarcity, at scale, becomes famine. And that is why Jesus places these signs together, not as separate warnings, but as connected stages within the same unfolding process. But here is what makes the connection even more direct, because it is not just about cost. It is about access. The Gulf states import approximately 90% of their food through maritime choke points, primarily the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. And when those choke points are disrupted, when shipping is blocked, rerouted, or halted under the threat of attack, the food does not arrive. Not at higher prices, not later, not at all. Jesus described a world shaking, and the world is shaking right now. Now step back and look carefully, because when you zoom out from the individual signs and observe the sequence as a whole, a pattern begins to form. Each sign feeding the next, each crisis compounding the previous, each one increasing in intensity as the intervals between them collapse. This is not random. This is a pattern. The pattern Jesus described, moving the world toward the moment that comes after the birth pains complete their work. But here is what most people miss. Jesus did not stop with the signs that are visible on the surface. He continued. And the next signs are not global events you watch from a distance. They are personal. They unfold in your life, in your community, in your relationships. And in many ways, they are more dangerous than war, because now the sequence shifts. The first signs affect everyone: wars, famines, disease, earthquakes. But the next sign targets a specific group, the very people Jesus is speaking to. Matthew 24:9. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Delivered up, afflicted, killed, hated by all nations. And the reason is clear: for my name's sake. Not because of politics, not because of ethnicity, not because of actions, because of the name of Jesus. Believers are not targeted for what they do. They are targeted for who they belong to. And that is what makes this different. Because it is not situational. It is identity. But the sequence does not stop there. It goes deeper. Matthew 24:10. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Now the pressure moves inward. Betrayal does not come only from governments or hostile systems. It comes from people who were once close, people who once stood with you, people who once called you brother or sister. And under pressure, under fear, under the weight of being associated with something the world rejects, something breaks, and they turn. Jesus makes it even more explicit in Luke 21:16. You shall be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives, and friends. And again in Matthew 10:35-36. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. The breakdown is not just global. It is personal. It is the neighbor who reports you, the coworker who distances themselves, the family member who chooses safety over loyalty. And that is where the sequence cuts deepest, because it is no longer something you observe. It is something you live through. And the pain of that betrayal, the quiet collapse of trust, cuts deeper than open persecution for many believers. Because persecution comes from outside. It is expected. But betrayal comes from within. It fractures what once felt secure. Relationships break. Confidence erodes. And what remains is a kind of isolation that is not loud, but heavy. And that isolation creates a condition, a vulnerability. Because when people are afraid, when they have been abandoned by those they trusted, when the world around them feels unstable, and the structures they relied on begin to fail, something shifts inside them. They begin to search, not casually, but urgently. They want answers. They want clarity. They want someone who can make sense of what is happening and tell them what comes next. And that is the moment the next sign enters. Because that kind of desperation does not go unnoticed. It is exploited. Matthew 24:11. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. Not a few, many. And not deceiving a small, careless group, deceiving many. Which means the deception is not obvious. It is not easily rejected. It is effective. It spreads. It captures people who are not foolish, but searching. People who are not indifferent, but desperate for truth. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because the deception does not appear as deception. False prophets do not present themselves as false. They do not introduce error openly. They present as credible, familiar, convincing. They use the language people recognize. They reference scripture. They speak with confidence. They build platforms. They gather followings. And in some cases, they demonstrate signs that seem to validate their authority. But the core of the deception is not in how different it sounds. It is in how close it sounds. Close enough to feel right. Close enough to pass initial scrutiny. Close enough to be accepted by those who are already unsettled and searching for stability. And then comes the deeper layer. Because what they offer is not correction. It is comfort. They tell people what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. They remove tension. They soften warning. They reshape truth into something more acceptable, more manageable, more aligned with fear and desire. And in doing so, they do not calm the situation. They distort it. And the environment created by the previous signs makes this even more effective. Fear lowers discernment. Betrayal weakens trust in legitimate voices. Instability creates urgency. And urgency reduces patience, making people more willing to accept quick answers instead of tested truth. And so the deception spreads. Not because truth is absent, but because falsehood is presented in a form that feels easier to receive. And this is where the pattern tightens. Because each sign is not isolated. War destabilizes. Famine pressures. Persecution isolates. Betrayal fractures. And deception fills the gap left behind. Each stage prepares the ground for the next, and the result is not just confusion. It is misdirection. A large number of people moving with confidence in the wrong direction, believing they have found clarity, when in reality, they have accepted something that only resembles it. And that is why this sign carries such weight. Because it does not just affect circumstances, it affects perception. And once perception is altered, everything that follows becomes harder to interpret correctly. And the pain of that betrayal, the quiet collapse of trust, cuts deeper than open persecution for many believers. Because persecution comes from outside, it is expected. But betrayal comes from within. It fractures what once felt secure. Relationships break. Confidence erodes. And what remains is a kind of isolation that is not loud, but heavy. And that isolation creates a condition, a vulnerability. Because when people are afraid, when they have been abandoned by those they trusted, when the world around them feels unstable and the structures they relied on begin to fail, something shifts. They begin to search, urgently. They want answers. They want clarity. They want someone who can explain what is happening and tell them what comes next. And that is the moment the next sign enters. Because that kind of desperation does not go unnoticed. It is exploited. Matthew 24:11. And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. Not a few, many. And not deceiving a small group, deceiving many. Which means the deception is not obvious. It is not crude. It is effective. it spreads. It captures people who are not foolish, but searching. People who are not indifferent, but desperate for truth. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because the deception does not appear as deception. False prophets do not present themselves as false. They present as true. They use biblical language. They reference scripture. They speak with confidence. They build followings. And in some cases, they display signs that seem to confirm their authority. But the core of the deception is not in how different it sounds. It is in how close it sounds. Close enough to feel right. Close enough to be accepted. Close enough to bypass discernment. And then comes the deeper layer. Because what they offer is not correction. It is comfort. They tell people what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. They remove tension. They soften warning. They reshape truth into something easier to accept. And in doing so, they do not resolve the crisis. They distort it. And the environment created by the previous signs makes this even more effective. Fear lowers discernment. Betrayal weakens trust. Instability creates urgency. And urgency pushes people to accept answers quickly instead of testing them carefully. But there is another factor that accelerates this. Reach. Deception no longer spreads slowly. It moves instantly. A single message can reach millions. Confidence spreads faster than caution. Emotion spreads faster than truth. So deception does not just exist, it multiplies. And that is where the pattern tightens. War destabilizes. Famine pressures. Persecution isolates. Betrayal fractures. And deception fills the gap. Each stage prepares the next. And the result is not just confusion, it is misdirection. People moving with confidence in the wrong direction, believing they have found truth, when in reality, they have accepted something that only resembles it. And that is why this sign carries such weight. Because it does not just affect events, it affects perception. And once perception is altered, everything that follows becomes harder to discern. If this made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for staying with me.
Creating this video was an intense journey of discovery. As we dug into these scriptures and cross-referenced them with historical data we unearthed, the pattern became undeniable. It's one thing to hear about wars and rumors of wars, but seeing the intervals between these events collapsing through our research was truly sobering. We spent a great deal of time searching for the right archival materials to ensure every point resonated with the way it deserves. This isn't just about ancient prophecy, it's about discerning the pulse of our world today. If this perspective shifted in something for you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep research for the truth together. Make sure to subscribe and join us for the next chapter.